Okay, hey everybody, welcome to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have a cool comparison for you. We've done this in the past, actually, with the last issue of, which would be the kind of third from the beginning there, blue dial model from Christopher Ward, post rebrand. We kind of covered a blue evolution, and it was more just a short video covering the different shades of blue that Christopher Ward has applied to its Trident line over the years. Today here, we're actually going to take a look at the actual updates and comparing, everything from the bezel action to the dial, the hands, the cases, the bracelets, the clasps, kind of all the way through each generation to see kind of how everything changed and refined and was tweaked all along the way to get us to the latest iteration, as you see there on the far right with the Trident Mark 3. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a closer look. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the original. This is the Mark 1. I would probably consider it the Mark 1.5 or 1.2 because this actually is after a rebrand. The original logo actually was spelled out, said Christopher Ward London on there, and then it actually had this kind of inset C, outset C with an inset W in there, and that was kind of the logo, and then it would spell out Christopher Ward. Eventually they came to this abbreviated model here, so there was kind of a mid-cycle update, and here of course you'll know there's a mid-cycle update in the Mark II where they went from, of course, the kind of abbreviated Christopher Ward branding to that that 9 o'clock prominently done branding there. So here's how it started out. So here's the watch. And, very basic, very handsome, but a bit of a mishmash of different styling cues from other brands that was brought together in a way that actually made something that was pretty original looking. It had a very Bremont-esque dial and handset, which also drew, of course, some design cues from the Seamaster, as you can see there with that wave dial. And then, very GMT master-like there with the polished center link, and then actually a really cool and kind of innovative clasp here, as you can see, actually with a really nice taper to it with the triggers, very different than what was on the market at the time. And then also you can see very simple diver's extension there that's pretty common in everything from Longines to even Rolex, up until a certain point, to have that kind of just stamped extension for the diver's extension. Now when they moved over here to the 600 model, when they broke into the Mark II, as you can see, they kept a very similar blue, very bright, very luxurious, but they beefed it up, twice as water resistant. They also moved the date there across really nicely. They added a pop of color there with the 600 meters versus the 300 meters. They pretty much removed most of the outer minute track and just kind of had it just indexed there. And then of course we do have the beautiful ceramic inserts, and then it went from 60 click bezel just to 120 click. Really nicely done. And of course everything was re-engineered, although it didn't seem like much had changed. It was more like they kind of just made this watch a better version, more clean version. So they left behind some of the the Bremont-esque indices and whatnot, kept the hands, reset that date, but everything else, as far as aesthetically, very similar, although they switched to, the bracelet does feel a bit nicer. The case is a little bit thicker, of course, with that new water resistance, but not that much. You can see it's mostly case back that changed, but everything was still pretty similar. The crown's different, a lot bigger, more tooly, meaty. And then this clasp now had this really cool, instead of the diver's extension, it had more of a kind of quick adjust clasp here. You could just basically pinch that. You can slide this in and out, and it gave you about half a link there of adjustment. And you can see that this was still, you know, pretty much a stamped form piece there. And now actually, you know, still with that CW logo still marked here, still, you know, some nice contours on the scissor clasp there, but really nice. And those are pretty much kind of the main carryovers, and then you can see a little bit more refined. Now let's go ahead and compare the Mark II, the original, to kind of the mid-cycle refresh. Now the mid-cycle refresh pretty much kept the same case, same bracelet, but now was rebranded and now had an updated blue. And as you can see there with the blues, really beautiful. I prefer the darker blue, although both of these are appearing much brighter than they normally were because of the basically the way that they're absorbing the light from my studio here. But as you can see, they did update the crown, so it wasn't as sharp now on the ends there. Really nicely done, and had that inset. And then pretty much everything else is the same besides the branding, and of course the dial is slightly different, you know, with the branding. But the pretty much oh, one thing I also forgot to mention is that in the Mark I here, it didn't have a loomed seconds hand, which, you know, is a point of criticism there, especially for a dive watch to not have running seconds loomed. So we have it loomed here. Still kept, of course, that onion handset and whatnot, very Bremont still, and then also kept the wave dial, but more of a subdued look. Here's a little bit more glossy. Here you're seeing it a little bit more satinized and matte. And, you know, now basically instead of seeing the Chris Ward, which is not a great logo if you really look at it, now spelled out again, but it was moved, and leaving this kind of space in that upper portion of the dial blank as kind of an open horizon, which I think has become a very signature look for them. And, you know, I've grown to really like it. But as you can see, you know, the lume's pretty much the same and whatnot. The pip, the bracelet, still pretty much the same. And of course the case, because it's still 600 meters water resistant, still the same. So pretty much mostly aesthetics, the branding, and then the crown being really the only upgrade. So now let's go ahead and move on to comparing the latest and greatest to its previous iteration. Now, stepping up to the, actually, another thing I should probably mention is it went from, you know, 42 millimeter to 43 technically once they moved up to the Mark II, and now back down to 42 now that we're up to the Mark III. And as you can see, side by side, I feel like the Mark III just fills the dial better, and it basically, from an aesthetic standpoint, if you look at these indices, they kind of took the baton indice and the layout that was already there, and they really just, you know, gave it something more. You can see that they're fatter, there's more lume chucked into there, they're taller, there's little bevels on the insides. So instead of just being, you know, a rectangular indice that filled with lume, they actually have a lot more fine details now. Also, you can also notice that there is just that glossy dial. They got rid of the waves because that was something that was, of course, a kind of a Seamaster trait. They updated the hands, and it was more of an evolution, but definitely do not look like Bremont signature hands anymore, which is really great. And then even the outer kind of index has been updated a bit now as well. It's still very reminiscent. I believe the text on the font is a bit smaller, but I think it all fits the dial really well. Also, they switched to a black date disc there, as you can see, and the bezels are now fully loomed, and it actually uses a different lume, which you'll see in the kind of the low light transition shots towards the end of the video. But the bezel action now still quite solid in this model. Now you compare it to here. Woo! Just another level of refinement there. Much smoother, beautiful to articulate, and of course that's even through these gloves. This is much notchier, say more reminiscent to something like an Omega. I'm sorry, not an Omega, an Oris Aquis, quite notchy. Versus now much smoother and kind of dialed in and more refined. And they also did actually refine the Trident there. Some other changes along the way is the case back, of course. It did used to have waves on it because it tied into the wave dial. Now the case back does not have waves on it because there is no wave dial. Also, it kind of has that regulator styling there for opening the case back. Very similar still with the scissor clasp, but now instead of being kind of a thinly folded piece there, it's actually nicely milled now. Also still has, of course, that updated logo, but you'll notice the pushers went from circles to actually kind of more oval shapes. And the nice thing is they actually, from a design perspective, you can see that everything lines up with the logo there, which is really nice. And then of course this little portion here lines up with the center links, so that's really beautiful. But the scissor portion is still pretty much the same, but now you do have the quick release little mechanisms there, which is great for switching out your bracelet and straps, which I think is amazing and quite a value, especially at this price point. The crown is still pretty close. It's just a little bit of an evolution, as you can see. Similarly finished there, but it's just a little bit more refined, a little bit more grippy. I'd say the same probably for the bezel itself. A little bit more refined, a little bit more grippy, as you can see there, when you really get into the details of the grips. And then of course all new, you know, which is what made it the Mark III. It's not just a little small incremental change. This is a huge change there. I mean, even the proportions and the scale, the taper is still the same, but now you have the larger center links. They're not polished. Even the sides of the links aren't polished, as you can see here. They used to be polished kind of pretty much all throughout the range. And then now you have still that very classic kind of scalloped side there, but now it has added contouring and beveling, which pretty much take it to a whole nother level. Also the thickness, it's pretty close to being the same. Still a 600-meter diver, but it's going to wear that thickness much nicer because of those little tricks and contours. As you can see, the cases do appear, you know, quite different, although they do have the same kind of backbone. And you can see here another good example of the refinement on this clasp. Look at here where before there was punches and you could see basically where things were pinned in to the clasp, to now where it's just fully milled and everything is concealed inside. So that's definitely really nice. And as you can see, really amazing kind of transformation. This is kind of that intermediate one, and I think it's really still a gorgeous watch. But here it just leaves kind of behind all of the old kind of homage-y, you know, mishmash type styling, and really refines it into its own thing. And it also keeps and refines what had made it stand out, which is the Trident. Counterweight, and honestly, Tridents are huge right now for some reason on new divers. There's like a new diver popping up with a Trident somewhere on there probably every week now, it feels like. So clearly Christopher Ward's doing something right, because they're actually kind of inspiring. It's funny because they were inspired by other references from the past, and now they're actually inspiring new references from newer, smaller brands. So I think that's really quite interesting. So pretty much tip top, you know, upgrades all the way around. Every kind of iteration, every generation has you know, markedly gotten better to bring you to what you have here now. So actually, let's go ahead. We'll mix things up a little bit, and we'll do the low light transition and the Lume kind of right now. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights. All right, as you can see, the Lume has slowly gotten better and better, whether it's being more thickly applied to also just using better Lume in general. More precise application, thicker application, whatnot. Basically everything's gotten higher quality. The trade-off has never been quality, build, fit, or finish. It's always been kind of an update or upgrade in the way that the watches look. Now, let's go ahead and do some light transition to kind of give you guys an idea of also the way the light plays off of this finishing, which can easily and very quite often be washed out by the studio lights. Also, the tones of blue are going to read a bit more clear here and more realistic than, of course, lit up by the studio lights. You can also see the way that the brushing, the uniformity on the way the light plays off of those bracelets, really beautifully done. You can see the way the Lume is fading away here on kind of the older spectrum, but also still fighting, pumping, blasting away on the updated model there. So normally what I'll do is actually kind of ramble off and finish this towards the end, but instead what I'm going to do is actually get these on wrist and kind of close my thoughts with a little bit more action, because I know it could be a little stagnant just sitting here staring at these 4 watches while I figure out my last couple closing thoughts. So let's go ahead and get these on wrist. Alright, so let's go ahead and start off with the earliest iteration here. 300 meters of water resistance, beautiful taper on the bracelet, great proportions and whatnot. As you can see with the extra indexing that's done there, it actually does kind of shrink the dial down, especially with the larger markers and whatnot. Really beautifully done, great finishing. Still, I mean, even to this day, this is, I mean, obviously this started out as probably a $400 or $500 watch, and definitely at this point, $400, $500 watches have gotten much better in general, but this is still pretty competitive if you ask me. This thing is still really quite nice. Of course, it does have that kind of weird crooked date choice there, but it's still a really nice piece that does feel quite luxurious and quite, has like a little touch of vintage there. So, but definitely lays nice and flat on the wrist, as you can see. The flattest of, kind of all generations, because it was the thinnest at 300 meters. So I would actually like to see the return of a 300 meter diver from Christopher Ward. I don't know if maybe they'll still call it the C60 Slim or something like that, or maybe they'll call it the C50, C40, C30. I don't know. But I think that would be really cool, especially with a lot of the improvements they've made. So now moving on to the Mark II, where everything got more expensive, more nice, essentially, and really more luxurious feeling. There's definitely more heft here. The bracelet is just a finer finish with a tighter fit there, so really improved all the way around. And as you can see, the case back does add a bit of thickness there, and the crown was a bit sharp. But it was also redesigned as compared to the original model there. So those were all changes incrementally done there, but on a larger scale, because this is really an all new everything, although the general shape of it and whatnot is the same and the proportions are quite similar. The scale and whatnot have been notched up a little bit to make it a bit thicker, and also about a millimeter larger. Now we move on. Of course, on the wrist, this isn't going to feel too different, although one of the things that's going to be a lot more nice on the wrist is going to be now with the finished edges there on the crown. It's not going to be sharp. This blue is much more subdued and sporty feeling versus kind of the luxe feeling here of the brighter blue. This definitely has more of a sporty vibe to it, and feels really great on wrist. Of course, wristies are always going to make it look a bit bigger. Here you get my arm in, you get a little bit more of an idea of the scale on my wrist, and I think you can see that the 43 works really quite nicely on my 7¼ inch wrist. So with all that said, let's move on to the newest blue beauty on this team, which is the Trident Mark 3. Of course, I did review the black model. It was a very early press model that I was gifted by Christopher Ward, but damn it, I liked it so much I had to buy a production unit for myself, and this beautiful blue, because I just love blue divers. If you guys know my channel history, my most viewed video by far is kind of the battle of the affordable blue Swiss divers, something along those lines. I will do a sequel eventually. I have a few new blue divers that I think compete really well, but man, there's something about the Trident that just makes this. Of course, they shrunk it down a little bit. Now it's back to being a 42, but they have added all these contours and chamfers and just high quality, beautifully executed. Of course, you also do have the quick release points on the end links there, and also this beautiful milled quick adjust clasp with these wonderful shaped triggers there, perfectly done. Everything lines up. Everything's just absolutely gorgeous. And they did add a little bit of visual interest there underneath the 12 o'clock with that kind of ghosted twin flag logo, which I think looks really great, honestly. And I'm glad that they didn't do it in like a white color that would contrast too much, because then I think it would have just made the dial feel a bit busy. And I think the open space on top actually is kind of a signature look for them now, you know, just as signature as having their name at the 9 o'clock. And it's just a gorgeous watch, and I think it just gives it originality, right? People kind of complain, why don't micro brands do more original watches? Then they do stuff, you know, to be more original, like having some weird canted date window and whatnot, and they do these little things, and they kind of slowly strip them away to be leading towards something that's more original, and then they give you something original and people still complain and they want it to look more like the less original one, which I think is a bit silly. I think that Christopher Ward has become a real trendsetter, and I'm loving what they're doing, and I would love to see more young micro brands be inspired by Christopher Ward and the success that they received with models like this. I mean, look at the way that thing wears. Look at the taper on that, beautifully refined. Great wrist motion there, as you can see. Great drape on that bracelet, the end links, although they are the male style links that do extend the case out a bit. You know what? It still wraps just absolutely nicely. And you could have a much smaller wrist than mine and it would still look really great on there. So with that said, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you like the video? If you did, please hit like. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.